Hello, hi, and welcome. If you are new here, my name is Sarah, and this is Wicked Reading. So today I want to talk about literary horror. So what even is literary horror, you may be asking? I feel like I've recently really been gravitating towards this particular subgenre, and it's kind of a very ambiguous type of subgenre. Some people's definitions are going to vary a little bit, but personally, how I think of literary horror is a book that may be classified as kind of like lit fic, but it definitely leans into horror, or you might even find it in the horror section, but it leans into kind of like the literary fiction aspect. And by this, I mean that these books tend to have a very distinctive kind of quality, tone, and approach to the stories. With these stories, I expect a lot of symbolism and metaphors with a lot of showing and not telling. I feel like a lot of these books invoke a deeper discussion and opens up a lot more of a analytical type of approach. I find myself annotating these types of reads much more often and really reading them a little bit slower to kind of digest and really understand the text, because I find with a lot of these books, the text isn't so straightforward. The story isn't so straightforward. There's a lot happening and being said between the lines. These books tend to have a stronger focus on atmosphere and themes, and for me, it tends to stir up a lot more kind of emotionally versus books that are a little bit more kind of formulaic, a very easy to follow story, easy to approach type of writing style. I feel like literary horror tends to kind of push the envelope a little bit, tends to have more experimental structures and formats within the book, where in that way the writing can be considered kind of like less approachable and tends to be a little bit more almost like poetic feeling, a little bit more flowery. These books a lot of times can be very ambiguous in certain ways, whether that be with themes that they're approaching or even the ending. You might end up leaving the story with more questions than answers. It might be very open-ended. It just leaves a lot of room for the reader to also kind of partake in the storytelling journey, and it almost like makes the reader get what they need out of the story. If that makes any sense, I hope it does. Not all of these books will have every single one of those elements to it, but they might have a few of those things going on. There's some other ways that people might kind of describe this particular subgenre, but that's really what I think of when I think of literary horror, and that's what I mean when I'm saying that something is more kind of literary horror. Now, obviously, because so much of these books are kind of meant for interpretation and much more of an analytical approach, these types of books are not going to be for everybody, and that's totally fine. These books aren't even always for me. While I really love this subgenre, I know that I need to be in a certain reading mood to take on a literary horror book, where I know I need to be much more present when I'm reading the story, and sometimes I just want a nice fluffy read. But nonetheless, I do really love these stories when I, have the time and dedication to read them. So that being said, I have 7 books here that I want to recommend to you guys that I consider literary horror. All of these books that I'm recommending to you, I gave either like a 4, 4.5, or a 5-star for. So I'm just gonna get this one done and over with, because this is probably, I would say, the most well-known, most read book of the stack of books that I have here, and that is Bunny by Mona Awad. This book has been very divisive since it came out, and I think that that has a lot to do because of the approach of the story. And for me, it is much more of a literary horror. In this book, we follow our main character, Samantha, and she is in a graduate writing program, and a few of the other girls in her program, it's like a very small program, there's like 5 of them total or something like that, maybe 6, but all of the other girls in her program are kind of part of this clique group, and they call themselves the Bunnies. They only call each other Bunny, and that's how they refer to each other, and Samantha's kind of an outsider of this group. But one day she gets invited to join their, I don't know, their like study group, I guess, and things kind of get pretty weird pretty fast. That's really all I can say with this book. If you've seen this on BookTube, you know that this book is very highly unexplainable. It's much more of a character focused book, I guess. There's just like no plot really. It's mostly vibes. This is complete atmosphere. There's stuff that happens and you just like, you don't even know what to make of them. The point of this book is almost that there's no point, but it's fantastic. The writing is so incredible. This is one of those books that it either works for you or it doesn't. It worked so well for me. I absolutely loved this book. If you're into kind of more bizarre, off the wall, inexplainable types of books, this might be a good read for you if you haven't checked it out yet. It's a wild ride. It's very fever dream feeling. The whole story itself felt very experimental to me. I highly recommend it if you're into bizarre, off the wall, literary weird books. My next recommendation is Warm Bodies by Isaac Marion. In this book, we are following the perspective from a zombie, and the world has gone through this zombie apocalypse kind of deal. So we start this book off already in the aftermath of that, which right off the bat I thought was really interesting because with a lot of zombie books, it's kind of from the timeline of a zombie virus or zombie situation starting to break out and kind of the survival of that breakout. This is after that, where people have created their new society that is isolated and gated off from the zombies that have already been walking around and being a thing for a little while now. So already I feel like that's a very interesting, unique aspect to this book. And the idea that we're in the perspective of a zombie to me is very interesting as well. This book has a lot of underlying themes when it comes to kind of human tendencies, what it means to be a human, societal structures, and we have some great representation in multiple characters that really represent the way different people might respond to this complete breakdown of societal norms and constructs. But there is a plot that involves a romance, so go in knowing that because that might make or break this reading experience for you. But I consider this more of a literary horror because it's not your typical horror story. Some horrific stuff has happened and there's a zombie involved, but there's a lot more themes and underlying aspects to this book, and the approach of it is so unique, and I classify it as literary horror. Next up, we have The Cabin at the End of the World by Paul Tremblay. This book is by far the one with the lowest average rating in terms of Goodreads ratings from all the books on this list, and I don't really know why. I thought this book was fantastic. In this book, we are following a small family, a 7-year-old named Wen and her 2 fathers. They decide to go on a family vacation to this isolated cabin in the woods when they are approached by a few strangers and they say, quote, "None of what's going to happen is your fault. You haven't done anything wrong, but the 3 of you will have to make some tough decisions. I wish with all my broken heart you didn't have to." And the story kind of takes off from there. So this is definitely kind of, it's an apocalyptic book. I don't think that that's necessarily a spoiler because it's kind of one of those, is it apocalyptic or isn't it? This book I just thought was great. This is 100% mostly character work. We get insights to what might be happening to the outside world, but we are very isolated into this cabin. So it does a fantastic job at creating that isolated atmosphere, a very kind of confusing situation where these strangers are telling them stuff that's going on in the outside world and that they need to do these certain things for this purpose. And this family just like doesn't know if they should believe them. So it's all around very confusing, chaotic. The writing style itself, I really, really like. We kind of just jump back and forth between past and present in terms of this family that are undergoing this very traumatic situation, being held hostage, and then they're just thinking about a very benign, happy memory of them making breakfast at home or doing this and doing that. So there's this really great juxtaposition that is created with these kind of fond memories and then coming back to real time where there's just this trauma happening. The whole time I was reading it, I was just thinking about how terrifying and confusing and life-altering this situation would be for any of the characters involved, whether it be the family or the 4 strangers. because they're all driven by what they believe to be right. For me, it was super effective. And the last chapter gave me absolute chills. This book does not give you answers. So know that right away. This is a book with an ambiguous ending, and it's kind of just dread the whole time. There's no silver lining within this book, and it's pretty bleak. And again, it's very ambiguous by the end. So you're kind of left feeling hopeless in a way. But I really loved it. I thought it was very unique and very effective, and I highly recommend it. But I will say that this is definitely the one with the lowest Goodreads rating of this list. Next, I have Tell Me I'm Worthless by Alison, Rumfit. In this book, we're following, I forget their name, Alice, Isla, and Hannah. And these 3 girls went into this house, and only 2 of the girls walked out, and they walked out very different. That's where I'm going to leave the synopsis, but this book has so much more going on with it. Right off the bat, this is definitely the most, yes, this is the most sexually explicit book on this list. So know that immediately. We get some very graphic, very detailed sexual situations. This book has a lot to do with transphobia. One of our characters is a transgender female, and actually the author is a transgender woman as well. So it ties in a lot of horror in relationship to the transgender experience and kind of the political spectrum of that. It also ties in some discussion points about fascism as well as racism. There is quite a bit of body gore and some very bizarre fever dream feeling moments. This book kind of has a lot going on with it, but I really enjoyed it. I feel like I just walked away with a lot of lessons and a lot of new perspectives. But again, this is not a light read by any means. This one is one of the 2 darkest books I probably have on this list. Again, it's very sexually explicit, and it's not a light read. Take care of yourself. This is definitely not going to be a book for everybody, but I just found it to be so unique. There's certain chapters that stand out in this where we just kind of get a glimpse of a different person in the world, which I found to be a very unique and interesting like adage to the format and structure of this book. Now, I will admit some of the stuff definitely went over my head. There was a lot of symbolism and metaphors that I feel like I did not fully grasp. So this is a book that I would absolutely want to and have to reread to fully kind of grasp everything. I ended up reading this while I was in the middle of a readathon, which I wouldn't recommend because this definitely is a book that fits in that literary horror where you kind of need to sit with it a little bit. You kind of need to read it slowly to understand everything that's going on. And when I was reading it in the middle of a readathon, I really didn't connect with it the way I should have. Nonetheless, though, it was fantastic, very unique, very dark, very twisted, but I recommend it if it sounds like something you might like. Next up, this book was very recently shown on my channel, so you might not be surprised by it. This is my most recent read of the stack that I have, and that is Jawbone by Ojeda. This is absolutely a literary horror in my eyes. This book was fantastic to me. I loved this book. I have it so well annotated. I ate this book up. In this book, we are following a group of 6 girls, although we mostly kind of follow 2 of them, Annalise and Fernanda. And they have been best friends since they were little. They're part of this girl group, and they kind of have very odd and bizarre interests and kind of very dark interest. They play games of like truth or dare, and they dare each other to do some pretty wicked things sometimes, like jumping down a whole flight of stairs, balancing on the edge of a building. They are quite out there. They like to make up horror stories, creepypastas. We also follow a teacher character named Miss Clara. Now we start the book off where Fernanda has been kidnapped by Miss Clara, and then we kind of deconstruct the story from there and slowly learn kind of the lead up to that and get just such a deep understanding of the characters in this book. I had an absolute blast with the format and structure of this book. We have chapters that are following Miss Clara, we have chapters that are following the girls, We have chapters that are jumping between time, chapters formatted as if they're kind of like a text message exchange. There's just a lot going on with this. One of the chapters is just absolutely one long paragraph with no breaks in it. So the formatting and structure is very unique, but it is very purposeful, and I really appreciated this book. It is so unique, but this is probably the second darkest book on this list. There is some hints of self-harm, and I don't know, I'm trying to think of like trigger warnings, but I'm not very good at thinking of them because I don't personally really have any that stand out to me that I need to watch out for. So I'm just like not as aware of them. But definitely check out trigger warnings if that is something that you need to do. This definitely has some of them. There is definitely a lot of themes around teenagehood, around girls' sexuality, and there's a tie-in with religion and the guilt that might come from that. Our teacher, Miss Clara, has a very obsessive personality and has a lot of anxiety, and there's kind of a lot with this book. There's a lot to be said, a lot to talk about. I thought it was done so well. The characters in this book are so complex. I could ramble about this book. And that's a reason also why I love these literary horror books. It's just not easy to pin down one talking point about them. All of these books could and should be part of like a book club discussion. There's so much to be said, but I loved this story and I highly recommend it. Next on this list, I have Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield. In this book, we are following our two main characters, Mary and Leah. Yeah, Leah. And Leah went away on a underwater excursion for this research project, but she ended up being gone way longer than she was supposed to be gone, and when she comes back home to Mary, she is very different. This book has a lot to say about grieving somebody who's not even like gone yet. We jump back and forth between Mary's POV and Leah's POV from when she was on the trip, on the excursion, so it's very dynamic. I actually consume this with audiobook, and I highly recommend the audiobook. We have two separate narrators, and I think that they did a fantastic job really bringing this story to life. But overall, this book is just kind of sad, very grief heavy, focusing on loss and the downfall of a relationship, and it has a lot of ambiguous elements to it as well. It's definitely a book that makes you get what you need out of it, and I feel like everybody would have a different experience reading this, whether they liked it or not. I feel like people who even all like this book have a different experience reading it and get something different out of it. But the writing is lovely, the prose is beautiful, and the concepts are great. I highly recommend this one. And the final book I have to recommend is The Salt Grows Heavy by Cassandra Khaw. This is a novella, so it's super short. I think I read it all in one day. It's 104 pages, so it's very short. This book is definitely the most poetic, most lyrical, most non-approachable prose on this stack, I will fully admit. This book takes a lot of focus to read it, which I don't mind as much because it's so short. If I had a long book written with such dense prose, I don't know that I would be able to make it all the way through it. But because this is so short, I appreciate it more. It's very poetic. So I'm not going to say much for the synopsis because it is so short, but in this book we do follow a mermaid that is now on land, and she goes on a journey with a plague doctor. They go into the forest and they meet some ageless children, and I'll leave it at that. It is very dark, whimsical, dark fairy tale feeling. There's some really wicked imagery that I really liked. There's like some barbaric medical procedure-esque stuff going on. I really love that, so it worked very well for me. I really enjoyed the overall story. I really liked how it like ended and tied up together. This is one that I should definitely reread. I actually originally listened to the audiobook for this, which I don't recommend because like I said, this is some dense text, and the audiobook was probably going over my head a little bit too often, but I am definitely going to eventually reread this physically, but I don't think that this is going to be for everybody, even in like the literary horror. Like even if you like literary horror, this is by far the most dense, the most poetic and flowery book of them all. Now I will say, from what I've heard, a lot of people that did not like Nothing But Blackened Teeth by this author did actually really like this one. So if you kind of were already not into it because of the author, because you might have not had a great experience with a previous work by them, I've heard people that didn't like that book, which I haven't read that book, so I have nothing to say about that. But people who didn't like that book did still like this one. So just putting that out there. One of the blurbs on the back, which I think really summarizes it good, and that is a feverishly gory, grotesquely beautiful, and baroque fairy tale meets love sonnet. Cassandra Khaw's imagination is limitless. I would agree with that. And actually, funnily enough, that blurb is by Paul Tremblay, the author of Cabin at the End of the World. So there we go. I agree. I liked it. I recommend it. So that is all the books that I have to recommend as literary horror books. Let me know if you agree or disagree that you would consider them literary horror if you read them. If you have literary horror recommendations, go ahead and leave them down below. If you enjoyed today's video, please give it a like. This is my first time doing a strictly recommendation-based video. So I would really appreciate it if you liked it and you let me know, and then maybe I can do some more in the future. And then while you're down there, go ahead and do all the other fun YouTube things to help your girl out, and I will catch you guys in the next video. Bye!